I no longer have to deal with a 6-inch wide joiner where I was using boards sometimes that were over the capacity of the joiner. I now have an 8-inch wide joiner from Grizzly that has parallelogram beds and a helical cutter head. And in the interest of full disclosure, Grizzly sent me this joiner at no cost to me. And in this video, I'm going to go through the unboxing, the joiner setup, and I'm going to show you guys my alignment process for setting up a new joiner. And I'm going to close with my general impressions. My Grizzly joiner came today, and it looks like it came in 2 separate boxes with the stand in one box and the joiner beds in the other. Now the fun part of taking this out of the boxes and putting it together. So the joiner beds look like they're packaged pretty nicely. Everything seems to have its own little place in the packaging, and it's all packaged in this plywood crate. So everything looks good. I had to get a friend to help me put the joiner beds on top of the stand, and man, this thing was heavy. It was a little bit of a workout. And there are 8 bolts that go underneath the stand into the joiner beds to secure it to the table, and that was pretty straightforward. And by the way, the manual is very easy to follow. It's pretty straightforward so far. There's not been any issues. I have the pulley installed, and I have it properly tensioned according to the manual. And I also have the fence carriage installed. So now I think I'm ready to put the back panel back on, and I'll start working on the fence. I have everything assembled at this point, minus the guard, and the next thing I did was check to make sure that the infeed and the outfeed tables were parallel to each other. And that did require some minor adjustments, and in order to make those adjustments, you need to turn these eccentric bushings. Man, that's hard to say. The first thing I like to do when checking for the alignment of joiner tables is to make sure that this axis along the outfeed table is parallel to this axis along the infeed table. And I like to do that with a dial indicator. So I have a dial indicator and a magnetic base, and the magnetic base is resting on the infeed side of the joiner, and the plunger is zeroed on the outfeed side of the joiner. Now if I slide the dial indicator back to the opposite side of the joiner, I shouldn't see any movement in the dial indicator needle if the 2 tables are parallel to each other in this axis. The manual states that you can align your infeed and outfeed tables parallel to each other by using a straight edge, but I just prefer using a dial indicator. I think it's a lot easier. Now originally my infeed and outfeed tables were not aligned to each other along that axis. I did need to make some adjustments to the eccentric bushings. Now in order to make the adjustments to the eccentric bushings, you need to remove a set screw above the eccentric bushing with a supplied Allen key. And then underneath that set screw is another set screw that you just need to loosen. Then you can turn the eccentric bushing. And the manual states that you can turn the eccentric bushing by using one of these pin-style spanner wrenches. You just put one of the pins in one of the notches on the eccentric bushing and the other pin in the other, and then you can spin the bushing. Now if you don't have one of these, the manual states that you can use a punch and a hammer. But I really do wish this joiner came with a tool that you could just put over top of the eccentric bushing and turn it in order to make the adjustments. But it wasn't that bad by using one of these pin-style spanner wrenches. Now that we've confirmed that the infeed and outfeed table are parallel to each other along this axis, in order to make sure that the 2 planes are parallel to each other, we need to make sure that the infeed and outfeed table are parallel to each other along this axis too. Now the manual states that you can again do this by using a straight edge, but I like to use a dial indicator. And I made this dial indicator jig a few months back to check for this, and all you have to do is zero the dial indicator on the front end of the outfeed table, and then slide the whole jig to the back end of the outfeed table. And if the dial doesn't read 0, then that means that the 2 tables are not parallel to each other along this axis. So I have the dial indicator bezel zeroed, and now I'll just slide the whole thing to the opposite end of the outfeed table. And it's measuring 2/1000ths of an inch. So that means that the outfeed table is lifted up by about 2/1000ths of an inch, and if I wanted to, I could keep making adjustments to the eccentric bushings, but I think I can live with that. The infeed table and the outfeed table both have a separate strip of metal that is joined to them close to the cutter head. So one of the things that I wanted to check is to make sure that this strip of metal is actually flush with their respective tables. For example, I want to make sure that this part of the infeed table is flush with this strip of metal, and I want to make sure that this strip of metal is actually flush with the outfeed side. And I'm going to do that with a dial indicator. I zeroed the dial indicator plunger on the infeed side of the table, and I'm just going to push the dial indicator until the plunger is over top of this strip and see if we still read 0. And we do. There was no movement in the dial. And I can do the same thing for this side of the strip. Nice and flush. So now I'm just going to check and do the same thing for the outfeed side. I zeroed the dial indicator on the outfeed side of the table on this strip of metal, and we'll see what the difference is as I push the dial indicator forward. 1/1000 of an inch. And we can do the same thing for this side of the table. 2/1000 of an inch. The 2/1000 of an inch difference between that strip of metal and the outfeed table is so minor that it shouldn't have any impact on the performance of the joiner. As long as the infeed table and the outfeed tables are parallel to each other, and as long as the outfeed table is flush with the cutters at top dead center, this joiner should work great. So the next thing I'm going to check is to make sure that the outfeed table is flush with the cutters at top dead center. And to check that, I'm going to use my dial indicator again. In order to use the dial indicator to check that the knives are flush with the outfeed table at top dead center, you need to zero your dial indicator on the outfeed side of the joiner, and then move the dial indicator plunger over top of the cutter head and move the magnetic base forward and back until you find top dead center. Right there. Now if I rotate the cutter head until it meets the top of the edge of the cutter, I should read 0 if I'm flush with the outfeed table at top dead center. And it says it's off by 1/1000 of an inch. If your outfeed table is not flush with the cutters at top dead center, there are 2 jam nuts in the back of the joiner that you need to loosen, and then you can make adjustments to the outfeed table lever. And once the outfeed table is flush with the cutters at top dead center, you can retighten the jam nuts. Because my cutters were 1/1000 of an inch lower than the outfeed table, I actually wanted this situation to be reversed. I wanted the cutters to be 1/1000 of an inch higher than the outfeed table. And this is really easy to do with this joiner, and if you use a dial indicator, you can make precise adjustments to your outfeed table, and you can watch the needle as you're making the adjustment so there's no guesswork involved. And all you'll need to use is a magnetic base, which you place on the infeed side of the joiner, and the dial indicator plunger on the outfeed side. The very last thing I need to install is the guard. And the guard has a post which goes into a recess on the front of the joiner, and the post has a flat spot which gets secured with an Allen bolt. I didn't mention this before, but this joiner came with a mobile base. And in order to activate the mobility, you just need to step on this foot lever and it'll pop the joiner up onto this wheel. And there's also wheels on the other side of the base. And then you can move the joiner around wherever you want. And then when you get it to where you want, in order to lower the joiner back down, I like to support the weight of the joiner with the infeed table and then just push the foot lever up, and then you can lower the joiner back down to the ground. The beds on my old 6-inch joiner moved on dovetailed ways, and they were kind of clunky to move up and down, whereas this joiner beds move on a parallelogram, and they're very, very smooth as you move them up and down. Incredibly easy to move. In order to move the fence in and out, you just need to release the tension on the lever in the back, and then you can move the fence either forward or back. It would be nice if this was one-handed operation where you could just hold the lever and then pull the fence either in or out, but you really need to do this with 2 hands. And once you have the fence where you want it, just lock the lever back down. In order to adjust the angle of the fence, you just release this lever behind the fence, and then you can tilt the fence at 45 degrees to you or 45 degrees away from you. And there are positive stops behind the fence for both the inward 45 degrees and the 45 degrees towards you. Now, the positive stop that I am most concerned about is the positive stop for 90 degrees because it's at 90 degrees where my fence on a joiner is most often. So I'm going to show you how I calibrate the 90 degree stop. In order to set the 90 degree positive stop on the joiner fence, the manual states that you can do this with a square. All you need to do is place one edge of the square against the table and the other edge of the square against the fence, and then if it's not square, you just need to make the necessary adjustments to the positive stop. And I'll show you guys how to do that later. Now that's a perfectly fine method for doing this, but I'm going to show you a method that I prefer using, which I think is a little bit more accurate and a little easier to do. And that involves using a dial indicator. Surprise, right? I have a block of wood with a dial indicator screwed to one side with a couple of screws in the front and a good 90 degree square. And I'm also using a flat reference, and in this case, a granite surface plate. All I need to do is zero this dial indicator bezel to 90 degrees, and then I can take this jig over to the joiner. Right there. In order to use the 90 degree positive stop, you just release this plunge lock, which goes into a collar which has a notch cut into it. Now, in order to make adjustments to the 90 degrees setting on this collar, you need to loosen this bolt with an Allen key. And now you can move the fence, and then once you have it set to 90 degrees, you just tighten this bolt back down. I have my 90 degree stop engaged and I have this bolt loosened, and with my gauge pushed up against the fence and resting on the infeed table of the joiner, you can see that it's not reading 0, which means that my fence is not set perfectly to 90 degrees. It's off by about 0.08 of an inch, and the fence is tilted away from me by a little bit. So with that bolt loosened, I can make adjustments to the fence. I need to bring it into me, tilt it towards me just a little bit. And once it reads 0 on the dial indicator needle, I can stop making adjustments and tighten down the bolt. Right there. And now I can just tighten down this bolt. There's one more thing I want to check regarding the squareness of the fence, and that is, can I move the fence in and out and still have the fence remain perfectly square? So we can easily check for that using the dial indicator. I put a Sharpie mark on the face of the joiner fence so that I'm always putting the dial indicator plunger in the same spot. And if my fence is still perfect 90 degrees, it should read 0 on the dial indicator bezel, and it does. So now I'm going to move the fence forward and take another reading. And it's measuring 1/1000th of an inch. So let's move the fence forward and take another reading. And it's measuring 2/1000ths of an inch. Because we can measure the distance between the dial indicator plunger on center and the lower screw on center, we can actually convert those distances into angles. And for 1/1000th of an inch, it equates to 0.03 degrees, or a fence of 89.97. And 2/1000ths of an inch would equate to 0.06 degrees, or 89.94 degrees. Now, for most woodworkers, having a fence set to 89.94 instead of 90 would probably be perfectly acceptable. Now, if you're interested in the math that I use to convert these distances into angles, you'll find it in the video description below. I have a 5-inch wide piece of oak, and the face of which has not been previously flattened on a joiner. And I took a red pencil and I made marks all over the face of the board. So we'll take this for a ride on the joiner and see how well she cuts. The surface of the board feels incredibly smooth. I'm really happy with the quality of the cut. The board is still a little bit out of flat in this one section over here because I still see some of the red pencil. So this board will require one more pass over the joiner. But really nice and smooth. All of the red from the pencil is gone, so that means the entire board is nice and flat, and it still feels really nice and smooth. Gotta love that helical head cutter. With the freshly face jointed edge against the fence of the joiner, I squared one edge to that face and I confirmed it for square by using a square, and it looks right on the money. I've owned a joiner somewhere around 12 to 15 years, so I'd like to think I have a pretty good idea of what I like and what I don't like when it comes to joiners. So as I went through the process of unboxing and setting the joiner up and going through the alignment process and showing you guys how well or how nicely it's able to face joint and edge joint boards, I did my best to highlight what I really liked about the joiner, and also I tried to find things that I didn't like about the joiner. And to be completely honest with you, I had a hard time finding things that I really didn't like about the joiner. I had little gripes, like it didn't come with the tool that was needed to turn the eccentric bushings, but I was able to get by with my pin style spanner wrench. But nothing major. It seems like a great machine, and I think it's going to be a welcome addition to my shop. So if you have any questions related to this joiner, please ask me in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. And I'll see you guys next time.